Speaking of which, let's talk about Biden and what we've seen from his presidency so far. But more importantly, the way that his performance, for lack of a better word, as president has been reported about in the media and what we could maybe expect from him moving forward. So, President Joe Biden's success in passing the latest $1.9 trillion coronavirus relief bill was met with comically hyperbolic language and liberal punditry regarding his supposed pivot toward Franklin Delano Roosevelt-style economic reforms. For example, Slate's Jordan Weissman wrote that Biden's COVID bill is his first step toward an FDR-style presidency. And look, it's not difficult to understand how exaggerated that statement is, considering how the $15 an hour minimum wage debacle unfolded. That debate abruptly ended with the Biden administration's refusal to overrule a non-elected Senate parliamentarian who recommended taking the minimum wage hike out of the bill. So to say that this is his first step toward FDR-style, economic reforms is pretty ridiculous. And it's particularly loathsome that minimum wage hasn't been increased since 2009. Yet Biden and the Democratic leadership couldn't muster enough of a fight to do something about it, to make sure that that provision was included in the final bill. And so I give you that example because it just shows you how, in terms of systemic change, in terms of permanent change, that relief bill did not deliver. And there was really no reason for Biden or the Democrats to hold back from any of these provisions, because when you look at polling, the vast majority of Americans across the political spectrum were supportive of these provisions, right? Including, yes, the $15 an hour minimum wage. As Matt Karp wrote in a wonderful Jacobin piece, you should check out the full article for yourselves. He writes that even as Senate Republicans dutifully held the line against Biden's bill, their own constituents had already abandoned the fight. 70% of Republican voters support direct payments of $1,400 or larger, while 60% support the overall $1.9 trillion rescue plan. Even one of the most revolutionary features of the Biden bill, a direct federal allowance for children, claims 60% support from Republicans. And that's certainly something that Biden and the Democratic Party should keep in mind as they claim they're going to fight to make that child tax credit permanent. For now, it is not. It expires by the end of 2021. Now, does this all mean that there's no hope left for Biden to actually accomplish, some of the progressive agenda items that people have been pushing for? To be honest, it's hard to tell, although Biden did unexpectedly show support for Bessemer, Alabama, Amazon warehouse workers who are working to unionize. This was something that was unexpected because in modern times at least, there hasn't been a sitting president who has said anything as supportive toward a unionizing effort or labor. Take a look.
Today and over the next few days and weeks, workers in Alabama and all across America are voting on whether to organize a union in their workplace. This is vitally important, a vitally important choice as America grapples with the deadly pandemic, the economic crisis, and the reckoning on race. What it reveals the deep disparities that still exist in our country. And there should be no intimidation, no coercion, no threats, no anti-union propaganda. No supervisors should confront employees about their union preferences. Every worker should have a free and fair choice to join a union. The law guarantees that choice. And it's your right, not that of an employer. It's your right. No employer can take that right away. So make your voice heard.
And look, obviously, issuing a statement is very different from successfully passing legislation that empowers workers, actual systemic change. However, I think that it would be a mistake to minimize how much a statement like that can galvanize workers, not only in Bessemer, Alabama, but certainly workers across the country. In fact, Mindy Eiser writes in Jacobin that it was arguably the most pro-union statement a U.S. president has made in decades. And so, sure enough, after Biden made that statement and after the efforts in Bessemer, Alabama got a little more attention, you will notice that there are workers across the country, Amazon workers in other facilities across the country, now considering a union. So we're talking about Baltimore, New Orleans, Portland, Denver, Iowa, and in Southern California as well. Bloomberg reports that the Retail, Wholesale, and Department Store Union, which is leading the drive in Bessemer, Alabama, says it has heard from 1,000 Amazon workers around the country. So this is great news. Also, one warehouse worker spoke to Bloomberg and said this: if the most powerful company in the world can be unionized in an anti-union state like Alabama, it gives hope to people in Louisiana, in Mississippi, and West Virginia who are trying to do the same thing. We just have to support the fight wherever it's at, because the fight is going to come to us. I absolutely love that statement, and it's true. And so Biden being on the right side of that issue does have an impact. And it would be wrong to not also give other lawmakers, Democratic lawmakers, credit for, drawing attention to that effort. Bernie Sanders, for instance, recently traveled to Bessemer, Alabama, along with Killer Mike, in order to help galvanize the efforts in Bessemer as well. So this all has an impact, and I'm glad that Biden at least said the right things. And then there's also the pro-labor bill that Biden has also supported, and he's called it's called the Protecting the Right to Organize Act, or the PRO Act. Nando did a great lengthy segment giving you all the details about that. But it was important for Biden to come out and support that. It would strengthen collective bargaining rights, override so-called right-to-work laws, establish new penalties for corporations that violate workers' rights, and prohibit employers from taking action against unions, striking in solidarity with workers at other companies. So it would be a wonderful sweeping labor rights bill. And again, Biden has come out in favor of it. In fact, urging the Senate to vote on the legislation. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer has even vowed to bring it to a floor vote in the Senate as soon as he has secured 50 votes. So far, he's reported that 45 lawmakers in the Senate are willing to vote in favor of that legislation. But look, we're talking about the PRO Act. We're talking about progressive legislative goals, and that's all fine and dandy. But we're not going to get anywhere unless we have a real discussion about nuking that filibuster, the legislative filibuster in the Senate, which forces the Democratic Party to get as many as 10 Republican senators to vote along with them in order to pass that type of legislation. We know that that Senate filibuster is trash. We know that it has its very intention is a racist one in order to prevent the passage of civil rights. And so Democrats need to stop kind of tiptoeing around that issue. And the real question is Biden willing to push the Democrats to either reform or throw out that legislative filibuster? Well, he was asked about that during his first presidential press conference. Here's what he had to say.
It used to be you had to stand there and talk and talk and talk and talk until you collapsed. And guess what? People got tired of talking and tired of collapsing. Filibusters broke down, and we were able to break the filibuster, get a quorum, and vote. So I strongly support moving in that direction, in addition to having an open mind about dealing with certain things that are just elemental to the functioning of our democracy, like the right to vote, like the basic right to vote. We've amended the filibuster in the past. But here's the deal. As you observed, I'm a fairly practical guy. I want to get things done. I want to get them done consistent with what we promised the American people. And in order to do that, in a 50-50 Senate, we've got to get to the place where I get 50 votes so that the Vice President of the United States can break the tie, or I get 51 votes without her. And so I'm going to say something outrageous. I have never been particularly poor at calculating how to get things done in the United States Senate. We're going to get a lot done. And if we have to, if there's complete lockdown and chaos as a consequence of the filibuster, then we'll have to go beyond what I'm talking about.
So again, Biden is saying a lot of the right things. He's saying he's willing to challenge the filibuster. He's saying that he's in favor of workers unionizing. He says he's in favor of the passage of the PRO Act. All of the rhetoric coming from Biden sounds great. And the media, corporate media, has really latched on to that rhetoric as a way of proving that he's pivoting toward FDR style economic reforms. Now, one of the things that really stood out was a piece written by Axios, and it disclosed the fact that Biden had this secret meeting with historians because he wanted to figure out, well, how big should I go? How far should I go? And should I model my presidency after FDR's presidency? At least that's the framing that you'll notice in the Axios article that I'm talking about. They write that the historians' views were very much in sync with Biden's. It's time to go even bigger and faster than anyone expected. If that means chucking the filibuster and bipartisanship, so be it. Now, look, it's important to avoid making too much of Axios's interpretation of Biden's intentions, especially when it comes to progressive policies. But with that in mind, the article also adds that one of the historians who met with him said that FDR and LBJ may turn out to be the past century's closest analogs for the Biden era in terms of transforming the country in important ways in a short time. So there's a lot that Biden allegedly wants to accomplish through a $3 trillion infrastructure and jobs bill. And so the real test is what that bill will include. Although I will say, as we hear the preliminary details of that legislation, it's already clear that it's not going to go nearly far enough to be anywhere on the same level as what FDR managed to do with his New Deal. But with that said, let's take a look at what we do know so far about what this infrastructure bill will include.
Within the next couple of days, President Biden's economic advisors are going to be briefing him on a proposal that they say will create jobs. And it involves spending about $1 trillion reportedly on improvements to roads, bridges, even the cellular network. That's the physical infrastructure piece. And then more money would go to investments like free community college, universal pre-K, and paid family leave. They call that human infrastructure.
Now, there are some good proposals, good provisions from, at least what we're hearing regarding the preliminary negotiations. Keep in mind that Buttigieg is involved in all of this, and that should be worrying. But aside from that, what we know is that it's unlikely to include free public college, just possibly free community college. And there's still no real conversation being had about canceling student loan debt. So already there are some issues. The Sunrise movement came forward and said that it doesn't do enough in spending and investing in renewable energies, which I think, based on what we know so far, is true. But what the media is doing is they're now kind of pitting Biden against Obama to kind of get everyone's hopes up about how Biden's going to be different. He's going to be bolder. He's going to go bigger. Now, keep in mind that we're dealing with a much bigger economic crisis now than we did even after the Great Recession. But the whole point here is, Biden wants to differentiate his leadership from, the failures that you might have experienced during the Obama administration in responding to the recession. In fact, Axios says that Biden loves the growing narrative that he's bolder and bigger thinking than President Obama. So if you just, tap into Biden's ego, maybe he'll do the right thing. And party leaders, by the way, from President Biden on down, they write, are citing Obama's strategy on his most urgent policy initiative, an $800 billion financial rescue plan in 2009 in the midst of a crippling recession as too cautious and too deferential to Republicans, mistakes they were determined not to repeat. And then they also write in The Hill that others in Biden's circle have argued that the Obama stimulus was too small, an error the current administration was adamant it would not make as it forged ahead with a $1.9 trillion COVID-19 relief package. And look, the good news is they're aware of the mistakes made, the terrible decisions made during Obama's administration. The question is, are they willing to really go in a completely opposite direction. And so far, what we've seen is no. And it's important for you to keep that in mind, because we're talking about actual structural changes here, not another Band-Aid on a gushing wound. But to be fair, the criticisms that they're putting out there regarding the Obama administration, especially about his reaction or response to the recession, is accurate.
In a development that pleased many Republicans, Mr. Obama wants more tax cuts than had been expected. Of the total stimulus, now at about $775 billion, he wants 40% of that, about $300 billion, to go to tax cuts, about half of that for business. For example, allowing companies to write off losses incurred during this recession and giving businesses a tax credit for hiring new workers. As for individuals, all but the wealthiest would get an immediate tax cut of $500, for families, $1,000. His team was encouraged by early reactions from Republicans to the idea of tax cuts.
Clearly, it's an area that brings excitement to Republicans because it does put money in the economy right away.
Republican sources on Capitol Hill say Mr. Obama went out of his way today to make clear he will continue to listen to Republicans.
And what did those tax cuts and all those concessions to Republicans lead to? Well, take a look at what the end result was.
While Americans suffered under an economic crisis, Wall Street was kept intentionally healthy and stable to avoid further decline. In fact, although President Obama campaigned on battling inequality, economically the wealth gap grew during his time in office.
And look, this is a little bit of a side note, but now with Biden and some of his aides openly talking about the fact that Obama didn't do enough to respond to the recession, you have people like Rahm Emanuel getting super salty about it, saying things like this to the New York Times. It's really about Obama versus Bush and Biden versus Trump, not the other way around. We built long-lasting, robust economic growth, he thinks. And I think comparing one to the other is historically not accurate. And also, more importantly, it's strategically not advantageous. I would disagree with Rahm Emanuel. I think that it's incredibly advantageous for the Biden administration to take a good, hard look at the failures of the Obama administration and actually respond to the economic crisis we're in appropriately. Now, again, the question is, can we expect that from the Biden administration? And to be quite honest with you, it's really hard to just expect Biden to do the right thing based on his own ego or based on a rivalry that he has with the former president, Obama. I think what you should really focus on is the real two competing interests at play here, because we already saw how these competing interests, played out during the stimulus bill, during the relief bill, the $1.9 trillion bill that some corporate journalists think was a sign of how Biden is just like FDR. The truth is, this is about private interests versus public interests, right? Versus the public's interests. And unfortunately, what's missing right now is that while corporate interests and private interests reign supreme, workers, unfortunately, people who would bear to, actually benefit the most from a robust economic policy are not organized. And so what was it like to actually push for FDR's New Deal? It was actually pretty bloody. And Jane McAlevey talks about that in this next clip.
So FDR comes in 32 election, 33. He comes into power, 25% unemployment. The conditions were really horrible in this country, and nothing was changing right away. He begins to do a bunch of stuff in the first 100 days, but he doesn't really get to meaningful trade union policy. He doesn't actually formalize and legalize what we call the collective bargaining process until the National Labor Relations Act, which happens in the summer of 1935.
Officially called the National Labor Relations Bill, it provides supervised union elections in industrial plants. It creates a judicial board to weigh disputes between labor and management.
The National Labor Relations Act is now the law of the land. We shall see the dawn of a new era of peace and justice for all in our economic life.
It took massive, unruly, messy, bloody, brutal strikes to win the passage of the National Labor Relations Act in 1935. And that's often just written out of history. It's like airbrushed out. So when we think about the New Deal era, what people talk about are the strikes that began in 1936 and 1937, which was the sit-down strikes, the big Flint strikes in the auto sector. And I keep trying to point out to people, those strikes to me, they mattered a lot. But the strikes that got us to those strikes, the strikes that got to the passage of the Wagner Act, which is the National Relations Act in 1935, were strikes that literally have just been airbrushed out. There were massive strikes in 33 and 34 and the beginning of 35. And those strikes created an untenable crisis that allowed FDR to come in and say, whoa, we got to do something here because they're going to pitchfork the place down.
So again, I mean, I'm not calling for a bloody, situation, but the fact of the matter is victories have to be fought for and won. And in this case, just relying on and appealing to Biden's ego is not going to go far enough to overwhelm the corporate interests at play here. And, the company, the umbrella or parent company for many of the fast food companies out there, known as Inspire Brands, has put out a memo bragging about the fact that they successfully defeated efforts to increase the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour. At the end of the day, what has the most sway and influence, again, is corporate power. And the only way that we can get lawmakers, whether it's in the executive branch or Congress, to serve our best interests is to make them bend to our will, to ensure that we have a seat at the table. And the only way that you can do that is through organized labor. History bears that out. And it's definitely something that should take more of the focus as opposed to personalities and what Biden's ego entails. Nando. You're muted.
Yeah, no, it was just that whole segment was making me think about Robert Caro's books on LBJ, which I know you are a fan of as well, because I think we often make the mistake of trying to figure out what is inside a person's mind or heart, and obviously people are complicated and it's impossible to really fully understand that. LBJ, who was oversaw huge progressive wins. Policy changes in the 1960s, civil rights, Medicare, things like that. He wouldn't have lifted a finger for any progressive thing if it meant any sort of risk to his own political power. He only did those things to the extent that it enhanced his political power, and that was due to conditions on the ground, in sort of historic, just material conditions, like in the country at the time. And with Biden, who we know who he is. He's the least kind of mysterious creature in politics because he's been around forever. He would never do anything for a progressive policy if it meant risking his own political power. But it seems like there might be some sort of positive feedback loop in which, if he does kind of these big, bold, progressive things, he might sense that it enhances his political power in some meaningful way. And to the extent that that's true, yeah, good.
Yeah, no, you definitely. And I think that the person in his ear about that is Senator Sanders. I think that what's happening behind the scenes is he's influencing Biden in the best possible way. But I still don't think that's enough because you have Senator Sanders competing with corporate interests. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, but the other thing that your segment made me think of was Obama, and just how every month that goes by, his presidency looks worse and worse and worse, because at the time he inherited this enormous economic crisis, and more crucially, just a huge amount of public discontent and rejection of Republicans and the Bush administration and things like that, and huge groundswell of grassroots support and all that stuff. His effect, I don't know, nor do I care what's in his heart. I suspect he's a striving psychopath like every major American politician. But his actual effect was to absorb all that energy and diffuse it, to tamp it down, to do everything possible to not encourage any of that. Just truly like sicko, like sick stuff, you know, and the effects of his presidency were just so disastrous in contributing to the sense of cynicism in this country, because he was such this, you know, presented himself and was in many ways in 2008 this kind of transformative figure, right? The first black president, blah blah blah, and you know, the actual effects of his administration, which were nothing, just a continuation of the status quo, contributed to like this enormous sense of cynicism that everyone feels. Like that was a moment that felt we could change something, that everyone was kind of activated, that everyone was excited, and and there was this guy who sounded different from all the other politicians and looked different from all the other politicians, and then blah blah blah, and then he turned out to just be an empty psycho like everyone else. And it just, like, I can't stop thinking about that, just how as time goes on, the Obama presidency looks worse and worse and worse. And I reckon that 100 years from now, if there is still in America, and historians are like looking back at these presidents, and they do like their little presidential rankings, like Obama's going to keep falling and falling and falling in that ranking. Like he just sucks. Like he just sucked. He sucked then and he sucks now, I guess is my point.
Yeah, and it is interesting to see, you know, Chuck Schumer, for instance. He was on the record, like he gave a press conference where he was pretty critical of Obama's response to the recession, which, it does feel like Monday night quarterbacking or whatever it is that they call it. But especially since Schumer's like not new to Congress, like, come on. But at the same time, I mean, I think you're right. Like you have people who worked for Obama aides, loyalists to him, coming out and getting super angry about Biden or any of his aides, criticizing Obama's approach. And they think that it's going to hurt Biden. They genuinely think like Obama's such a popular former president that you're really hurting yourself in pointing out, you know, Obama's mistakes. But I mean, I couldn't disagree with that more. I think that people don't just know, they felt in their personal lives how awful that response to the recession was. I mean, think about the number of foreclosures that took place. And then you have these, you know, investment companies and banks come in, snatch up all of those homes and turn them into rental properties. You know, which has led, it's been part of what's led to a housing crisis in the country. So Obama, you're right. I think as people analyze Obama's presidency and take a closer look to what actually happened through his lack of economic reforms, they'll see that he doesn't deserve the popularity that he might have right now in the polls.